Husband's been secretly taking trips to see a woman in another state, lying about work obligations, and I'm not going to whisper this or soften the edges. I'm Noor, I'm 32, and I'm a high school English teacher who spends her days turning kids into close readers while apparently I forgot to close read my own marriage. The thing about lies is they always choose the scenic route, and mine started with a slide deck. You know the kind, 36 heroic slides about quarterly targets that are allergic to punctuation. My husband Sam emailed it to himself from his work laptop the night before a client summit in Brisbane, asked me to skim it for typos because I can spot an errant apostrophe at 20 paces, then fell asleep snoring into the pillow he refuses to admit is old. While he slept, I scrolled. Bullet points. Charts. A crisp agenda with rooms and times. Then in the footer, a hotel address in Melbourne, not Brisbane. I stared at those 10 letters and felt the floor under my attention tilt. The next slide had a photo placeholder still labeled Insert Group Shot Here, which is when my teacher brain raised its hand and said, "Excuse me, something isn't adding up." By morning, the deck had been updated, now Brisbane, neat and confident as if a word can move a city. He kissed my forehead, grabbed his carry-on, and told me he'd text when he landed. I said okay because I've taught enough teenagers to know you let the story tell on itself. The bell in my chest rang and the lesson began. First period, we were annotating an essay about truth and memory. I wrote on the board, evidence, inference, claim. I said, readers, don't accuse, assemble. I wanted to laugh and cry at the same time for how much the universe loves a thematic unit. During lunch duty, I checked our airline points. He'd booked a flight to Melbourne at 6:05 a.m. seat 9C window because he likes to pretend clouds are privacy. I breathed through it. I graded 3 papers. I underlined a sentence in a sophomore's draft. People get brave when no one is watching, and wondered if I was brave with everyone watching or just tired. I didn't text him. I let the day play out in all its ordinary detail, muttered hellos, a coffee that tasted too roasted, a girl crying quietly over a pop quiz because she hadn't slept. After school, I fed the cat and the basil and myself. He sent a photo at 7:40 p.m. of a dinner table, a glass of wine, a caption, client vibes, which sounded written by a person who wanted to hear a specific answer back. I replied with a thumbs up, which is the emoji equivalent of a locked door. Sam and I have been married 6 years. He is tender with strangers and occasionally callous with me, the kind of man who remembers your barista's dog's birthday but never replaces the foil. He works in regional partnerships, which means travel and slides and hotel loyalty points and a rolling suitcase always half-packed in the hall. We met because he attended one of my school's career days and told my class that curiosity is revenue, and I made fun of him in the staff room for a week and then inconveniently fell for the part of him that meant it. The first big clue was not a text or a scent or a lipstick smudge, it was geography. A few months back he started taking 2-day quick trips for FaceTime with clients he named in a blur. The calendar invites looked real enough, titles with nouns that did push-ups, but the return airports changed. Brisbane. Adelaide. Then, suspiciously, Melbourne on weeks he swore he was in Brisbane. The details weren't flamboyant, they were almost boring. That's how you know a lie is trying to set down roots. I teach my students to love boring evidence, timestamps, receipts, the background of a photo. When Sam fell asleep on the couch that Thursday with his phone near my lesson plans, I didn't scroll for scandal, I opened the airline app. Gold status, 2 recent flights to MEL, 1 return that didn't match a single expense report in our shared folder. I checked his calendar, the client summit link opened a placeholder page, not an event. I checked our joint account, an Uber receipt at 11:52 p.m. from a street in Fitzroy he has never mentioned. I copied the address into Maps, Street View blinked awake, and there it was, a narrow terrace house with a red door and a jacaranda leaning into the roofline, the kind of pretty that suggests a person inside who waters their herbs and arranges their shoes. I closed the laptop and went to wash my face so I wouldn't cry into our towels. In the mirror, I saw a woman who teaches teenagers that words matter and realized mine were about to. I decided on a plan: gather, breathe, ask, decide. Not in the heroic order of movies. In the survivable order of Tuesdays. The next day, he texted a photo of a conference room with a city view that could have been any city. Panel going great, he wrote. I asked, "How's the weather in Brisbane?" He shot back, "Humid," which was helpful because Melbourne was having one of its crisp mornings that make your coffee taste earnest. I felt a click somewhere under my sternum. Not the shatter of shock. The latch of certainty. Saturday I told him I was meeting a friend for yoga and instead took the 8 a.m. flight to Melbourne with a carry-on that held nothing and a notebook that held everything. The plane was full of people in weekend clothes and patients. I landed, bought a tram card, and rode to Fitzroy because sometimes the shortest distance to a truth is a map. The red door looked smaller in person. I stood across the street holding a takeaway coffee for courage and watched the world behave around the moment I didn't want. A cyclist swore kindly, a kid dragged a scooter, a woman walked by with tulips, and then the door opened. She was less mythical than the version I'd feared, no cinematic hair, no neon laugh. A woman in her 30s with a braid and a denim shirt and a face that looked like she'd slept well. She stepped out with a tote bag and an expression I couldn't decode. Behind her, Sam appeared, not in work clothes but in the t-shirt that says his home. He put his hand on her shoulder the way you do when you've practiced and followed her into the morning. My face did not do any of the falling apart I had rehearsed in my nightmares. It went still. I took one photo not to inflict on myself later, but to stop the part of my brain that would otherwise forever argue that I had dreamt it. I didn't follow. I don't have that gear. I went to a cafe, ordered toast I couldn't taste, and opened my notebook. Facts, I wrote. Then I listed them in a teacher's neat hand because I needed to see the story behave. Airline records, multiple Mel trips labeled as BNE in conversation. Uber receipt, Fitzroy, 11:52 p.m. Red door, denim shirt, Sam's t-shirt, hand on shoulder. Panel weather lie, humid vs actual forecast. Slides with 2 different cities. Underneath, I wrote a sentence so boring it glowed, "You cannot fix what you refuse to name." On the flight home I didn't cry. I planned a conversation the way I plan a lesson on a difficult poem, pick a text, set an objective, anticipate the dodge. I would not mention the woman's hair, her face, the fact that she looked like the kind of person who alphabetizes spices. I would ask him for nouns and verbs, not metaphors. When he deflected, I would not chase. When he got theatrical, I would lower my voice. And when he tried to sell me the storm, I would point to the barometer. He got home Sunday evening breezy and tired. He kissed me at a distance that used to be closeness. We ate the dinner I made while memorizing my lines. He started to stack the plates, eager, helpful, and I said, "Sit." He sat, and that's when I felt a tiny mercy. He didn't pretend not to know what was coming. 2 questions, I said, steady as roll call. Who is she? And how long? He looked to the right the way he always does when he's looking for an exit that isn't there. Her name's Mara, he said, voice too light. We met at a partner event. It is complicated. I shook my head. Try again. Complicated is what we call a math problem. This is simple. Who? How long? He exhaled. About 9 months, he said. In Melbourne. Not here. He said it like a favor. I let silence sit between us until it became a third person at the table nodding with me. Here are my conditions for any next hour we might have, I said, and slid a sheet of paper to him because I do better with paper. No minimizing. No geography excuses. No pasting the word love in like duct tape. You will answer what I ask concisely. Then I will tell you what I need. Then you will leave for a while so I can hear the house. He nodded, a small nod I recognized from staff meetings when a kid has been caught vaping in the bathroom and their favorite teacher refuses to rescue them with charm. Okay, he said. And he did answer in a clumsy relay of details that turned my stomach and strangely steadied me. He'd met her in August. He told himself he was lonely because my school went through a brutal term and I gave my students my best hours. He told himself geography made it less real. He told himself 1,000 self-comforting little stories and he believed all of them because he said them with a tone that looks like care in the mirror. When he had finished, I said, "Here's what happens now." My voice surprised me, not sharp, not soft, just accurate. You email her while seeing me and tell her you are married and that you have been lying and that you will not contact her again. You send me every itinerary you've flown the past year and every expense you kept off the joint card. You pack a bag and go to Gabe's for 2 weeks because the walls need a rest from your mouth. You book an individual therapist before you reach the corner of our street and a couples therapist after I decide if I want that. You tell your mother so that I don't carry your family's image management. And you will not, under any circumstances, write me a grand apology letter in the voice of a man in a movie. You will be ordinary and consistent, and I will decide what that earns. He opened and closed his hands. I'll do all of it, he said too fast. Good, I said. Start with the email. He typed. His thumbs hesitated over 3 words, I am married, and then he pushed them into the world where they belonged. The reply came in under a minute. Mara, I didn't know it was this. I won't contact you. My chest hurt in a way that was mercifully not poetic. He left with a backpack and a face that had learned where its corners are. I locked the door and did the smallest, most saving thing I could think of. I made tea and stood in the doorway while the kettle hiccuped. The cat twined around my ankles. My heart, that dramatic student, asked for a performance. I gave it a rubric instead: eat, water, sleep, call minute, mark 3 essays, fold the laundry, open the window. I can't tell you how unromantic that sounds and how holy it felt. The next days were all fluorescent honesty. I called my principal and took 2 personal days. She didn't ask why, because women in schools know when an answer isn't a gift but a weight. I met with a lawyer who wrote down numbers and never once tried to name my feelings for me. I spoke to a therapist whose office smelled faintly of oranges and dust jackets. She listened to my story like a librarian, quiet and fierce, and said, "You are allowed to choose again." I made a private bank account. I moved my paycheck. I turned off Find My because my nervous system doesn't need to track anything but me. Sam sent screenshots, therapist appointment, account logins, the email to his boss turning down the TravelFlex perk, which is corporate for unmonitored flights. He asked if he could call. I said, no calls after 9 p.m. and not when I'm eating. He said okay and didn't try to sell me exceptions. I slept in the center of the bed. It felt rude and absolutely correct. You want to know about Mara? I wish I could give you a villain, it would be easier to carry. But the only villain is what happens when a person gets hungry for unearned and decides to eat the life they already have. She emailed me once, a careful note that said she didn't want to hurt me and she was ending it and she wouldn't reach out again. I believed her because the sentence didn't audition for sympathy. I put the email in a folder named Closure and promised myself I wouldn't open it at midnight. Everyone asks at some point, "Are you staying?" I answer in present tense, only today I'm staying apart. Today I'm meeting the couple's therapist because I want a professional transcript of our attempt. Today I refuse to be generous with my story in public because privacy is not complicity, sometimes it's medicine. I'm not letting the future bully the present. Students kept being students. One turned in a poem about an orange peel that made me tear up in the photocopy room. One asked if I believe people can change and I said, yes, with boring consistency, and she laughed like I'd told her a joke about vegetables. I told my juniors that the structure of a thing decides its possibilities. We looked at sonnets. I thought about marriage vows, how they make rhythm out of terror. I told them form is a friend and they all groaned and I grinned, and for an entire period the most important betrayal was between a comma and a hyphen. 2 weeks later, Sam stood in our doorway with a small suitcase and a therapist's look about him. Less invention, more verbs. He didn't ask to move back in. He asked if he could come in and sit. We made tea. He told me he hadn't slept properly the first week because shame is a terrible roommate. He said his therapist was making him list every time he wanted to dramatize his effort and replace it with a habit. He said he'd told his mother and she'd cried an old kind of cry, the kind that mourns the person you could have been instead of the one you were practicing being. He didn't reach for my hand. He kept his voice in a range my heart could tolerate. We wrote rules like lab partners. Phone in the bowl at 8. Calendars merged, real locations, not acronyms. A weekly meeting on Tuesdays at 7 where we each bring one truth, one ask, one thanks that isn't about productivity. Any travel must include screenshots before and after the fact. If he feels lonely, he tells me by saying, "I feel lonely," not by booking a flight. If I feel distant, I tell him before my class essays eat me alive. If either of us wants to quit, we say, "I'm thinking about quitting," and let that sentence sit in the room like a grown-up. If he ever lies again, we will call a locksmith for our marriage and an attorney for our exit, and we will not confuse those roles. We went to couples therapy on a Wednesday that smelled of rain on hot pavement. The therapist, Elena, had owl glasses and an expression I trusted. She made us say the words we'd been editing: betrayal, boredom, ego, grief, ordinary. She said affair like you say headache, treatable, recurrent if you don't change your water. She asked him what he wanted from Mara. He refused to ask me for. He said, praise without context. She asked me what I withheld. I said, I gave my students the best of my presence and expected him to applaud my leftovers. It stung. It was true. Truth didn't heal us. It gave us a floor to stand on while we tried. Days turned. He kept being boring in the right ways, showing me his calendar, canceling a quick overnight that made my chest tighten, forwarding an email that said no to a roadshow slot because he's choosing fewer opportunities and more reality. I kept being boring in my own saves, saying yes to dinner even when I wanted to tunnel into book piles, asking for a walk, texting him I'm prickly today so he didn't mistake my quiet for contempt. When I had nothing kind to say, I told the truth by doing the dishes. You want a tidy ending. I get it. I teach arcs. Here's what I have instead. The classroom clock is crooked and I straighten it each morning, and that tiny act keeps me sane. The basil on our sill survived the heat wave because I set a reminder and didn't rely on hope. The cat forgave both of us because cats understand the difference between performance and presence. My sister sends me recipes that begin, first, chop an onion and breathe, and I do, and it helps, and sometimes I cry over the cutting board, and sometimes I laugh, and sometimes I just chop. Last weekend, he asked if I wanted to take a day trip up the coast. He suggested we leave our phones off for 3 hours. He didn't try to make it symbolic. We drove, we didn't talk too big, we ate chips, we pointed at a ridiculous dog and grinned, and when we got home he sent his therapist a note that said, practiced ordinary joy, and he didn't copy me. I found out because he told me Tuesday at 7 when he brought his one thanks to the table and said, thank you for letting the day be a day, not a test. I said, thank you for not turning every apology into a sonnet. We both laughed and then we didn't, and the not laughing felt like the closest thing to relief. If you are me in that first moment with the slide deck shoulders squared at the kitchen counter, here's the smallest, strongest advice I can pass across the table. Be a close reader of your own life. Gather your boring evidence. Write your conditions before the storm edits your mouth. Choose a friend who doesn't need the gossip to love you. Keep water near. Move your money. Make a therapist appointment even if you aren't sure you're staying, because staying also requires a plan. Allow anger to turn into boundaries, not monologues. Refuse grand gestures until ordinary ones prove they can carry weight. If you need to leave, leave with a list and a packed bag and the quiet dignity of a woman who graded her own heart and refused to inflate the score. If you try to stay, stay with a rubric. Either way, you are not a plot twist in someone else's story. You are the author. Tonight the apartment feels balanced again, not because it's healed but because it's honest. The cat is asleep against my leg. The basil is being dramatic and I love it. Sam is at the sink, sleeves rolled, humming under his breath. He looks over and asks simply, tea? And for once, the question isn't code for anything. I say yes, and he nods, and the kettle starts its small, faithful song. It isn't forgiveness. It isn't forever. It's a cup of hot water and leaves, 2 mugs on a counter we both wiped, a quiet minute where the only trip either of us is planning is to the couch. I hold that minute with both hands and let it be enough.